And we will be in chapter 13 here in just a moment. If you want to grab your questions out, if you have those, we'll run through the questions for chapter 12 real quick and just to review, and then we'll get into the actual study of chapter 13 this evening. We've been taking, I guess, what probably we would estimate in some ways is a survey approach to the book. We've tried not to get too overwhelmed with so much detail that we miss the message. And so we've been careful not to dive too deep into a lot of speculative thought where we won't be able to draw any kinds of conclusions, and try to just get a basic understanding of how this book is a book of encouragement, how it would strengthen the believers, how it would help those who might be under persecution at that moment in time or in the future. And we've tried to stay the course when it comes to that kind of approach to the book. But if you have those questions, grab them just real quick. I'll show them to you on the screen as well as we go through them, and just to refresh our memories about chapter 12. So he said, when a man, and again, when I say he said, I didn't write these particular questions that we've been using, but he says, when a man sinned through the enticement of Satan, God pronounced a curse upon the serpent Satan and announced a war between the serpent and the seed of the woman. Is that true or false? That's true, based on Genesis chapter 3. You see that kind of picture in Genesis 3, and it's a very similar picture that we experienced in chapter 12, though we had some discussions about the specificity of the birth of Jesus, as well as the birth of those who would become His followers and that remnant of God. We talked about how the meaning could have kind of a dual approach in some senses and in specifics, but certainly there was a conflict that was going to occur between Satan and Jesus and ultimately His followers. That was referenced in Genesis chapter 3 as well. Christ was born of a virgin and therefore is the seed of woman. And that's true as well as you look at those texts that he related and shared with you. The promises, that's not even a question, by the way. That C is just a statement. Question D says, the Apostle Paul identifies the seed as Christ. In Galatians 3:16. Yeah, in that text, that's the discussion in Galatians chapter 3, verses 16 and 29, and they are somewhat parallel to what we studied in Revelation 12. Who are Abraham's seed? Yeah, Abraham's heritage was not just a physical heritage that would come after him, but Abraham's heritage pointed to those who would come after ultimately the seed, which is Jesus, would arrive. And so the promises of Abraham were not just about his physical nation, though it would be tremendous and there would be great things that would occur in relationship to it. The ultimate pointing towards the future in relationship to Abraham was all the nations of the earth will be blessed through that seed, through the promise, which was Jesus. He said, a sign appeared in heaven of a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon, and we've seen these imageries before, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Okay. Light. And that's what you see. You see with the dragon, with the beast imageries, with those imageries you see darkness, with imageries relating to Jesus, His followers, the faithful, the martyrs. We generally see light images in relationship to those things. Who are the children of light according to John 12 and Ephesians 5? Yeah, we can just identify them as Christians or followers of Jesus. What was the woman about to do? She's about to give birth. And another sign appeared of a red dragon, and having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns. And again, these are imageries that we've been studying and seeing throughout the descriptions. The dragon stood before the woman to devour her child. Stop the progress, right? And remember, we talked about that in various ways. We talked about the fact that if you want to talk about it literally in relationship to Jesus, then certainly effort was made. Tremendous pains were taken to try to stop the progress of an apparent king that had been born. So much so that even boys under the age of 2 were being killed in order to try to see whether or not they could catch up with the one that they were concerned about. And so in the fleeing to Egypt to avoid that. So Satan's efforts through men, but Satan's efforts to try to stop the progress of what God had in store through Jesus started at Jesus' birth, but it progresses, and he tries to devour every beginning instant. He tries to devour the instance of faith, what happens in the lives of folks. You look at the parable of the sower, and what do you see? You see descriptions of how the seed can take root, but it quickly, Satan comes in and does what he can to stop and stymie that process. And so you can see this description in Revelation 12 very specifically as it relates to Jesus, but you can also see it generically as it relates to his followers and those who were striving to be people of faith. The male child was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Okay. And was caught up to God and his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared by God where she was nourished for 1,260 days. Remember, that's referenced sometimes as 42 months. It's referenced sometimes as 3.5 years. It's an indefinite number. It's an incomplete number. It's not a number that has any specificity to it. We see the number 7, we understand completeness. When we see other numbers within the narrative, we kind of have an imagery of that. But this number repeats, but it's a very inconclusive kind of number. Now skip ahead a few pages in order to get the next set of questions. To jump, I believe, to page 54. It'll say 12-5 at the top of it. Because he segmented chapter 12, which I did not do in our approach. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels, but the latter did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven. We talked about that spiritual conflict, and then the dragon sent into the earth to begin to wreak havoc and create challenges for believers and followers of faith. All of those statements in B are all true. Okay, they all are descriptive of that being. Because the accuser of the brethren has been cast down. Okay, so he's using an approach that's different than what you might read in King James, but he said salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. And who is now ruling and reigning then? And Christ is. Okay, Christ is now reigning. As it relates, there's temporary battles that are being won, if you will, by Satan and his efforts, but ultimately Christ will reign. And that's the encouraging part of the message, is that no matter what challenge you may feel like you're being overwhelmed by in the present, and no matter how many momentary successes that Satan and those who are being used by him are having, ultimately at the end of the day, Christ will reign superior. Ultimately at the end of the day, Christ will reign. And that's where we're going to have to put our faith and trust and confidences in to be able to come our tribulations, their tribulations. It's the answer to the weaknesses of faith that we often have to be or are challenged by. The brethren overcame the devil by all of those things. That's right. The heavens and they that dwell in them rejoice. And finally, a woe was announced for the inhabitants of the earth and the sea because the devil, all of those, right, are descriptive. Okay, and so that summarizes for us chapter 12, reminds us in brief of the things that we talked about as it pertains to chapter 12. Was there more? No, there's not. Yeah, there is. You're right. I don't like questions. I just want to move through them. All right, you're right. I threw my sheets away, though. Let me grab them again. Thinking I should have flipped one more page. All right, so what did the dragon do after he was cast to the earth? And he brought the persecutions. And what was given to the woman to aid her escape? Okay. And so an ability to escape. How long was she nourished from the presence of the serpent? I heard about 18 different numbers. Neither of them. Okay, it's the same number we've been seeing. It's the incomplete kind of concept that we've been seeing throughout. What does serpent do? Right, it's flood, right? The flood came out from him. And what did the earth do? Yeah, earth swallowed some of that up. And we talked a little bit about that on Sunday, how the earth, in the sense, the world can even be a cooperative effort in relationship to helping us and them escape the challenges that you may be facing. You may not be a Christian, but if you have compassion and you see an individual being persecuted, you may come to their aid and assistance, surely because they're human, not necessarily because you have any religious conviction in connection with them. And there are times throughout history, I suppose you could illustrate, where there were those who were of the earth, of the world, that came to the aid of religious people from a human standpoint. And so that's kind of what I see here when he talks about the serpent. Satan floods the earth from his mouth with all kinds of falsehoods, accusations, deceits, you name it. But even the earth, in some senses, swallows some of that up and helps us defend ourselves in some ways against that. Not all of it, but some of it. When the dragon could not destroy the woman, he went after her offspring. And it's Christians, right? And it's these folks that keep His commandments, that keep the testimony of Jesus in their life. That's where his focus should go. All right, that finishes the questions. Now I can set these aside, I think. Let me look. Let me print. All right. Chapter 13. So, John begins to see within the vision, and keep in mind, we haven't left vision form here yet. We sometimes start getting into these, especially these chapters, and we begin to try to literalize. I don't even know whether that's a word, but we're going to use it tonight. We begin to look at things very literal all of a sudden, where we recognize symbols and signs and pictures. But the further we go, sometimes the temptation is that we're witnessing something that's real, in the sense that it's actually happening. That's not the case still. We're still in vision mode. And John is still seeing pictures and signs that are describing events and circumstances, and not necessarily contemporary to him, not necessarily all past, not necessarily all future. The context will move from time to time. And so he said, I stood upon the sand of the sea. And what did he see? He saw a beast rise up out of the sea. And it had 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns were 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And so this beast emerges from the sea. And it's interesting imagery. Here's John, and where does it say he's standing as he's witnessing this vision? Okay, so he sees himself standing on the sand, and so you're watching, and out of the sea emanates this beast, this imagery of this beast that comes forward. You can see this thing with its 7 heads and its 10 horns, and we've again talked about the nature of those numbers and the implications of that. There are some, and I recognize why this conclusion is made, and we briefly talked about it out of chapter 12 as well, but Rome at the time had 7 hills, right? It was a 7-hilled capital. It had 10 tributaries or 10 provinces that were serving it at that particular time. And so some have looked at those numbers to kind of point more specifically to Rome. It works, but what I've always tried to make argument out of the book of Revelation is if it doesn't specifically tell me, then I want to be cautious to not try to act like I've got a 100% understanding of something. If the book had been more specific And we could talk a little bit about that when you think about it. If John had written this in more specific terms, a sea beast comes out of the sea, it looks like this, and it is Domitian, then what's the problem? Yeah, message never gets anywhere. Okay? And even if it does begin to circulate, what happens to the people that are circulating? Yeah, they're in danger. Okay, they become in danger. And so and that would be true, by the way, of Domitian. It would be true potentially of Domitian, I should say. It would be true potentially of Nero. It would be potentially true of many of those Roman rulers and rulers throughout history, for that that description could be true of. It's interesting. We sometimes, from a traditional argument, make the case that Domitian was the worst of the worst among these Roman rulers, and therefore this has got to be the time period that Revelation is talking about. It's kind of hard to do that, actually, from historical record. That you would assume, because of those arguments that are often made, that there's just a great big stack of books somewhere from antiquity that just point directly to that concept. When the fact of the matter is, our knowledge of that time period is very limited from a secular standpoint. In fact, the Bible is the most documented of all of the books that come out from that time period and documentation of things that we have in terms of the amount and volume of manuscripts and so forth that are available to us. And so I say those things with somewhat cautious tone. That as if I was there and knew Domitian was the worst of the worst. I don't know that he was. I do know that history seems to bear that he wasn't so bad in his early reign as he was in his latter reign. And if we are correct in our conclusion that the book was written in those mid to late 90s in terms of the dating of the book of Revelation, and that would have been right at the time just before Domitian's executed. So at the worst of his worst, anyway, you could probably make that case. But he was as bad as he had been in his later years of reign. But be cautious, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make. Make sure that we just don't make wide sweeping generalizations that maybe we've just kind of heard over the years as being factual, when we may not have as much evidence of those that maybe we think there are. But be that as it may, here's this beast that comes forth. And it's speaking what kinds of things at the end of verse 1? Blasphemous things. Okay, so it may have some specific person. He didn't name him as a contemporary. I have always felt, and I haven't really said this yet in our study, but I have always felt that if the writers had future men and nations in mind, there's no fear in writing that. Right? If this verse referenced Hitler, if it referenced some other future person or group, then there's no fear in writing that. So I don't know that we can make that argument. I'll stand on the idea anyway that if this was all about future people and future references, then there's no fear in naming who those people are or what nation it is. Rome wouldn't fear some guy named Hitler that was coming, who knows how much longer later. Or they wouldn't fear some ruler they hadn't even heard about. And it wouldn't be as difficult for them to say those things. And so keep that in the back of your mind as you're going through this. Don't be careful to not try to make absolute conclusions about who's being referenced, because we may have to be a little bit cautious about that. Yeah. And you'll see him, stymied, and then you'll see another come forth. And irregardless of what specific distinctions they may have, that apparently the key that we're supposed to understand is what they did and the challenges that they brought. That's what John wrote for us to in the most understandable ways. And I think, too, from a generic standpoint of our study of the book of Revelation, Gary, I think we can make the mistake of that we don't make with other books. Sometimes we'll see another passage in an easier to understand part, and we'll say, well, apparently God didn't want to share that with us. Apparently God decided that what He did tell us was sufficient for us. We get to the book of Revelation and we're no longer satisfied. That same rule all of a sudden doesn't apply. And I think it needs to apply. This is what we have. And let's gain what we can understand. And again, not get lost in trying to make all these distinctions to the point that we miss the message. The message is blasphemy's coming. And it's coming against God's people and God Himself. And there's some forms by which it's going to happen. So he says, the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. So we know that one thing we can, I believe, understand is that the beast and the dragon are two separate things. Okay? Though they're working in harmony with each other. The beast and the dragon, I believe, are two separate entities. Because the beast is deriving its power and influence from the dragon. And so I believe we could make that argument that you're dealing with two distinct, and we pretty much know who the dragon is, right? That's pretty much Satan. Every time we see him defined. He was defined clearly, especially in chapter 12 and verse 9, very specifically stating who he was. And so we can move forward in respect to that. This description, by the way, is extremely similar to Daniel chapter 7. If you looked at Daniel chapter 7, you would see tremendous similarities between the descriptions that are happening here and what's going on there in that narrative. Let's run back there real quick. Just so you know I'm not lying to you. So Daniel begins to speak about visions. And in verse 3 he says, 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion, had eagle's wings. Beheld till the wings thereof were plucked. It was lifted up from the earth, made stand upon the feet as a man. A man's heart was given to it. Another beast, a second like to a bear, and it was raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. In verse 6, behold, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And so really what I think you see is, in many senses, John combines the first 3 animals of Daniel chapter 7 into one. And he describes, maybe in some senses, that if Rome is under discussion here, or whatever power is under discussion, if he's combining the imagery, then quite likely he is combining the reference to the power. That the power of the beast that comes forth from the sea, that the dragon is influencing and giving power and sustenance to. If John's writing Daniel's description over again as all 3 lumped into one, he may very well be describing how powerful that beast is. That here's 3 distinctive descriptions in the book of Daniel chapter 7. John combines all 3 descriptions, maybe in an effort, if anybody's familiar with what Daniel had to say, for them to go, wow, those were all powerful within themselves in Daniel chapter 7. Now John writes to us about a beast who is all those things wrapped up into one. And so there may be some of that imagery going on here, where this tremendous power is being described, and a tremendous ability to have an effect. Daniel's 4th beast fits the description John gives, and seems to probably illustrate that they are speaking of the same group. Who was Daniel speaking of in the 4th description? Rome. And so John makes that distinction. So you might see there is some internal evidence. When you combine Daniel's thoughts and John the Revelator's thoughts, Rome is highly likely under discussion here, if John's borrowing from Daniel's imagery. Go ahead, Jim. Well, and certainly they represent power of some sort because they have an ability to influence, and the descriptions seem to show they have authority. In fact, he says the dragon has given them, enabled them to have certain levels of authority. So I think you are talking about potentially specific kings, potentially specific powers. It didn't define it. It didn't define it. Yeah, that's the point I'm making. Well, I perfectly agree that I'm highly comfortable with pointing this to Rome. Don't misunderstand me. I think there's plenty of internal and secular history that would substantiate a quality argument, if you will, that we're dealing with the power of Rome in this discussion. But absent of a more specific reference, I just always want to say things with somewhat caution in relationship to that.
They didn't know when Daniel wrote his.
Yeah.
We know from history.
Right, we can back up and look and kind of see them unfold. Exactly.
And the people in that day may be able to back up and see who they are.
Well, if they're able to back up and count world powers, they would be able to draw a fair conclusion that they're in the fourth one, if they were able to identify the first three powers that had existed and recognize they were there. And let me throw one more food for thought at you that to be honest with you, I don't know that I had thought about until today when I was studying this afternoon. We're looking at this and reading the book of Revelation without the aid of any contemporary in relationship to the time period in which John wrote it. Now, most of the time, that's not as big of a problem. We can read the book of 1st or 2nd Corinthians and gain a pretty easy conclusion about what's being written, or the book of Galatians, other works. But the nature of this writing, how's this message going to get to these 7 churches of Asia? So, yeah, and somebody's going to have to what? Somebody's going to have to deliver, right? And you're probably not going to use some kind of structured delivery system, right? You're going to probably use Christians, other Christians who are able to travel into these regions and take this message. And if that's the case, most likely they have had a conversation of some kind. And I'm simply illustrating to you that I think they had an edge that we don't have. And that is, they would have had somebody potentially bringing them this letter who had had a conversation with John when he wrote it. Or at least after he wrote it and begins to have it delivered. If you think about it, when he begins this writing, he said, I was on. Not I am on. He said, I was on. When all this happened, I was on the Isle of Patmos. So the implication of that to me is that that's where he was when this happened. When this letter begins to be disseminated, he had reprieve from that. But either way you look at it, I believe that might have been an edge that they had that we don't have. Is that they would have had the ability to maybe talk to somebody who had had contact with John concerning these matters. And potentially would have been able to have somebody give them some clarity when they lacked it. Whereas we don't have that same ability. That's right. They may have had somebody standing before them reading this and saying, now let me remind you about what Daniel said. Much like what we're doing in some senses. And so anyway, that's just food for thought as you're studying the book. Especially on the frustrating days when you're just kind of going, I don't get it. Just remember some of those things. So he saw one of his heads, verse 3, as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. So some kind of calamity has happened, and you can look at this maybe two different ways. The world may have looked at this and were amazed at the fact that the beast could even be wounded. Or you might argue that they're looking upon the beast and going amazed at how quickly he healed after such a wound. But either way, the beast has the attention of whom? Everybody. Okay? So whomever or whatever is being described by the beast, it has the attention of everybody, which highly fits Rome of its day. That the whole world would be watching to see what's happening and marveling at times at the various responses and what seems to be happening among men according to verse 4. So they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshiped what? The beast itself. Saying, who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? The power that Rome had in that time period was overwhelming. So much so that you can almost look at parallel thoughts of on one side you're worshiping the dragon, which is Satan himself, but that has almost transformed to where they are now actually worshiping the tool that the dragon is using, which is potentially Rome and the power that it has. And again, some argue about the power of Domitian and the influence, though there's not a great preponderance of information out there that shows some great deeds against Christianity that he specifically, but certainly you could see that. And as you push forward in their history in their latter years, it seems to actually in some ways progress worse and worse over time. Yeah. Yeah. And my conclusion about that, when they witnessed this initial blow, this initial wound, and it survives, and then they say to themselves, who could make war? He can take that kind of blow and come out the other side okay. And they begin to marvel at the power and ability that the beast demonstrates. Yeah. And again, there's some references to maybe the early, when we're talking about Nero and the things that he was doing in the late 60s. And then later we'll see another Roman ruler come into effect. Nero dies. It takes his life at one point, and so some would argue that when they witnessed the nation take such a blow like that to lose their leader, and they would have assumed that when the leader was gone, that the nation would crumble. And then they're marveling because it didn't. It survived that. So again, there's all kinds of pieces of history that you might be able to kind of squeeze into the puzzle. And they relatively fit the descriptions at hand. And I'm willing to accept those facts. Well, that more describes the challenges that Satan and God were having, in a sense, before, and then ultimately he ends up being sent into the earth to wreak his havoc for a undisclosed period of time. Yeah, I don't know that it has a direct parallel here. So there was given unto him a mouth, verse 5, speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue, there's our days, 40 and 2 months again. And he opens his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme His name and His tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. Simply put, nothing was off limits to the beast in his mind. He would speak out against and blasphemously speak against God Himself, against the believers in God, the followers of Jesus. He had reached a pinnacle in his own power that he felt that he was absolutely, there was no vulnerability. And whomever I choose to speak out and blaspheme against, so be it, because I'm invincible. There's nothing that anyone or any nation or anybody could do to harm or create difficulties for me. And so he opens and speaks blasphemous things against God, to His purposes, to His tabernacle, to those that dwell in heaven, to the believers. It never ceased in relationship to that kind of conduct. He would mock and scoff and would openly show his disdain for God. I think there's a difference in some ways in terms of at least its effect. There may be a lot of people who have certain levels of disdain for God and His followers and believers, but it's a relatively quiet disdain. They're not necessarily vocal. They're not necessarily purposeful in their efforts to try to create problems or difficulties. They just have kind of a personal disdain for anything religious or anything that would be considered by them to be a superstition of some type. The description here is a very open challenge. You're not talking about someone who just has a personal dislike for God or God's followers. He is openly blasphemous towards them. And his efforts to create harm and difficulty for any believer is very open and public in its nature. Yeah. Yeah, you can see some parallels with the things that are going on in both of those moments. Anyone else? So it was given to him, verse 7, to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. He had all kinds of resources, in other words, at his purposes and uses to bring challenge and make war with the saints, the believers, the followers of God. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And so the persecution seems to fit the global influence that Rome had. The description seemed to fit the fact that those efforts were being felt not just in a particular region, but much wide-sweeping influence. And it's interesting. Verse 8 kind of describes the world as, and you talk about how complex the book of Revelation can be sometimes. He just defined for us basically two groups of people. Who are they in verse 8? Yeah, one's in the book of life and the one's not in the book of life. One of the most simplistic statements you maybe will find within the book of Revelation, where he distinguishes two groupings of people in that world, and I suppose that would continue to exist in the world. Those whose names are in the Lamb's book of life and those who are not. Now, I will say a word of caution, particularly if you're reading from more modern translations. Be careful, because the wording in this verse has led some Calvinistic thought that from the foundation of the world, the names were already, in other words, it's already been pre-decided who's in the book of life and who isn't. And I don't, that's not at all what I believe he's arguing here or saying. There's, from a predisposition standpoint, there's definitely the ability for God to know who will be saved and who won't. And we've talked in the past from different aspects that there's a difference between what God knows and what God causes. Those are completely two different things. It is absolutely possible for God to know an outcome without forcing an outcome. And you know that's not a hard concept to grasp. You and I may see a scenario unfolding before our eyes. And you've probably been there. You've seen it start to unfold, and you almost want to say something, but you don't. And then as soon as it occurs, you say, what? I knew that was going to happen. Knew it all along. I could see it happening right in front of me, but it wasn't my place. I didn't know whether I could say something. Right? Just because you knew what was going to happen doesn't mean you caused what was going to happen. God has an ability to know who will be His and who will not be His without forcing or causing them to be His or not His. And so if you wanted to discuss that from that standpoint, just be careful. Because particularly, and I won't fill your mind with it, but there were a handful of more modern translations that I looked at today that almost give that kind of feel to it. That you were dealing here with God's kind of predetermined approach, as if He was deciding ahead of time who had right and who didn't have right. And so you do have to be cautious sometimes with things. But really, He's just describing two groups of people. Those in the book of life and those outside of the book of life. And then the declaration in verse 9. What is that? If any man hath ear, let him hear. Who says that? We see Jesus say that, right? We see Jesus making that kind of statement in His preaching and teaching to draw the attention of the listener. I've got something to say. It needs to be listened to and heard and appreciated. What happens to those who lead into captivity? They go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. So, I just got done hearing about a beast that comes out of the sea. And boy, we wounded him good. And he survived and came out stronger than he was to begin with. And that might do what to me as a believer? I'm feeling pretty vulnerable right now. I'm looking at this scenario and thinking we might have had our best opportunity to overcome some of these things, and this beast is now even stronger than he ever was. And I'm in my mind, I'm trying to figure out how am I gonna win here? How am I going to overcome with seemingly this beast's success and his inability to really to be overcome? And then here comes a simplistic statement. Those who are leading folks into captivity will find themselves captives. Those who are killing with the sword will find themselves being attacked with the sword. The biblical principle of you shall reap what you sow holds true all the time. It's a true truth. That you reap what you sow is a truth. It's not an idea. It's spoken of within Scripture as a truth. And so he encourages them to appreciate. Let this be your patience. Let this motivate your faith. There is consequence to their action. Again, we've already studied. It may not come in the most timely of fashions. It may not happen in the manner in which we would like it to. It may not get to be defined by how I thought God should handle it. But let your patience and faith persevere. Those who conduct themselves in this fashion will ultimately reap the consequence. And you take a half a breath, and then what happens? Here comes another beast, right? So John gives this first image of this sea beast, and he talks about it gets wounded, but it survives. The world marvels. Everybody's worshiping it. There's basically two groups of people: those who are worshiping the beast, who is by his connection worshiping the dragon, which is Satan, And then those who are in the book of life, you've got the world kind of just divided in those two simplistic kind of things. He brings this brief encouragement of faith and conviction for the believers that they need to have in the midst of this. And then he says, then I looked to the land, and behold, another beast coming up out of the earth. And he had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. And he exerciseth all power of the first beast before him, and causes the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So, you see, basically, the first beast gets wounded and is healed. Or heals, maybe I should say. And then the second beast comes along, and what's he compelling people to do? Yeah, he worshiped the first. So the second beast appears to be an ambassador, if you will, to the first. He's out promoting how people should be responding and reacting to the first. The wounds have healed up. The ambassadors have once again begun to be sent out to compel people to be followers, not of God, not of Christ, but to be followers of potentially Rome and its power and influence. And though it took a wound temporarily, its power continues to be felt. Yeah. 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 And let's look at that, because I think verses 13 and 14 tie into that, Ed, into that picture. Because you see that imagery of a lamb, something a little more subtle than the leopard and the bear and that imagery that came out of the sea beast. And he says in verse 13, he doth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live. And so, the first beast seems to come and approach things with brute force. The second seems to come with subtlety and deception. Again, remember, several times in our study, we talked about the fact that Satan gets to use anything he wants to use in the process. We talked about the fact that as soldiers of Christ, we're limited, right? We have but one sword, and that is the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God, right? We have to play by the rules. We can only speak truth. We can only use means of righteousness. Our efforts to do our work are limited by what Scripture allows. Satan has no limitations. He can use brute force. He can use deceit. He can use lies. He can take the truth and flip it and try to deceive people with it. He can appear as an angel of light. Satan gets to do anything he wants. And now he's come with more of a deceptive approach towards his efforts than maybe that brutality approach that he once showed before. And didn't quite finish. So we'll talk about that, Lord willing. We'll finish that description of this land beast, Lord willing, on Sunday. Answer the questions to chapter 13 and potentially, well, most likely, move on into chapter 14 then on Sunday morning.